All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to tackle something that I think brings a smile to most faces, but historically, in philosophy at least, has been met with a pretty serious frown. It is humor.
Yeah.
It's kind of a universal human experience. It's probably something that you, listener, value. But if you were to scan through the centuries of philosophical thought, you'd find surprisingly little attention given to it.
Right.
And often the attention that is given is quite critical, so you're someone who likes to get to the core of things efficiently. So we're going to do a deep dive into what the great thinkers have considered about why we find things funny.
Yeah, absolutely. And for this exploration, we've turned to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Of course.
Specifically, the entry on the philosophy of humor. And you can kind of think of this as a rigorously structured and well-respected guide, leading us through this kind of neglected landscape of philosophical ideas about humor. It maps out the key theories, the historical viewpoints, and gives us a pretty robust framework for understanding this seemingly light topic, right? But actually, as you'll see, it has some real intellectual substance.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of detail that you as a philosopher would appreciate.
Right, exactly. The mission here is to unpack these central philosophical theories of humor, grasp the historical context in which they emerged, and offer you someone who enjoys a good intellectual workout, a richer understanding of what humor is, why we value it, and its unexpected connections to other significant areas, including philosophy itself.
Right.
So let's jump right in. Why has humor, something that's so prevalent in human life, been viewed with such suspicion by so many philosophers throughout history?
Well, one striking feature from a philosophical perspective is the lack of sustained engagement with humor. Compared to the extensive debates that you find on, things like knowledge or ethics, humor very often is relegated to the sidelines.
Right.
So you find from ancient times well into the 20th century, you mostly find fleeting remarks, a few paragraphs here and there in different texts.
Right.
A notable exception, a relatively late exception, is Henri Bergson's Laughter, which appeared in 1900. And that was, I think, the first book-length treatment by a major philosopher.
Right.
So one might almost conclude from the historical record that philosophers thought we could do without humor.
Huh. And when they did turn their attention to it, the view was predominantly negative.
Yeah.
We're talking about a philosophical tradition spanning over millennia that largely dwelled on the dangers of uncontrolled laughter or its connection to negative emotions, rather than really exploring the nuance of wit or comedy.
Precisely. And I think Plato really sets an influential precedent here. So in the Republic, he raises a concern that laughter as a powerful emotion could undermine that rational self-control that he sees as essential for his ideal guardians.
Right.
And he even worried about depictions of gods laughing in Homer, for example, arguing that this is unbecoming, right, for beings of such high moral standing.
Right.
So I think a core insight from Plato is this fundamental tension that he sees between laughter and reason. And that's a concern that really echoes through a lot of subsequent thinkers as well.
Right. And his critique wasn't just about the loss of self-control, was it? He also seemed to identify a kind of darker moral dimension to our amusement.
Yeah, so in the Philebus, he delves into the enjoyment that we derive from comedy, suggesting that it's rooted in a form of scorn.
Right.
He identifies the ridiculous as a kind of evil, specifically the vice of self-ignorance in others.
Okay.
So when we laugh at someone who mistakenly believes that they are, say, wealthy or virtuous, Plato argues that what we're doing is taking pleasure in their deficiencies, which he deems morally problematic.
Okay.
And this line of reasoning leads him to advocate for rather strict control over comedy in the laws.
Right.
Suggesting that it's best left to non-citizens and not to be taken seriously by those who are striving for virtue.
Right. So no philosophical endorsement of stand-up comedy in Plato's ideal society.
Well, that's right.
And it sounds like Aristotle, while he acknowledges the value of wit in conversation, wasn't exactly a champion of humor either.
So Aristotle recognizes that wit is a desirable trait, in conversation.
Oh, right.
But he shares Plato's apprehension about laughter, expression scorn.
Okay.
So he describes wit in the rhetoric as a kind of educated insolence.
Okay.
And he also cautions in the Nicomachean Ethics against excessive jesting, viewing it as a form of mockery that might even warrant legal prohibition.
And the Stoics, with their emphasis on emotional discipline and, rational self-governance, they certainly wouldn't have been known for their hearty laughter.
Not at all. Consistent with Plato's concerns, they firmly believed that laughter diminishes self-control.
Right.
And we see this in Epictetus in the Enchiridion. He advises against loud, frequent, or unrestrained laughter.
Right.
And we even have historical accounts suggesting that he himself never laughed.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So these early Greek perspectives really lay the groundwork for a philosophical tradition that was, largely wary of humor.
Yeah.
And it seems like early Christian thinkers further reinforced this negative view, drawing on some pretty severe interpretations of laughter in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a crucial point to consider.
Yeah.
The biblical portrayal of laughter, it's overwhelmingly linked to themes of hostility and judgment.
Right.
You have the well-known Psalm 2, where it depicts God laughing in derision at earthly rulers who oppose him.
Right.
You even have prophets who are supposed to be divine messengers employing laughter to express ridicule.
Right.
You see this in Elijah's mocking of the prophets of Baal before their very dramatic demise.
Right.
And you have the story of Elisha and the children who jeered at him, which serves as, I think a very stark illustration of how seriously mockery was taken at the time.
Yeah, the 42 children who are, mauled by bears for a bit of teasing kind of underscores a prevailing negative attitude.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's an unequivocal example of that sentiment.
Right.
And we see this reinforced then by early Christian leaders, figures like Ambrose, Jerome, Basil, and Chrysostom, who synthesized these biblical passages with, the existing Greek philosophical critiques and issue warnings against both excessive and even general laughter.
Right.
And the concerns ranged from, the loss of self-control to associating laughter with, less virtuous traits like idleness or lust.
Right.
And you even see Chrysostom painting this kind of concerning trajectory from laughter to inappropriate speech and ultimately to violence.
So within, monastic orders, those strongholds of self-denial and spiritual discipline, a pretty strict stance against humor would naturally follow.
Absolutely.
Right.
Joking was explicitly prohibited in some of the earliest monastic rules, such as those of Pachome.
Right.
The very influential Rule of St. Benedict advised monks to avoid frivolous talk and excessive laughter.
Cool.
His very well-known ladder of humility even included specific steps, discouraging laughter and jesting.
Wow.
And we even see in some monasteries, that of St. Columbanus Hibernus, for example, they even had severe disciplinary measures for even smiling during religious services.
Wow. So this anti-laughter sentiment seems to have persisted throughout the Middle Ages and even intensified during the Reformation, with the Puritans really reaching new levels of condemnation.
Indeed, the Puritans were particularly vocal, and they produced extensive writings denouncing laughter and comedic entertainment. So you have William Prynne, who wrote this massive 1,100-page work arguing that comedies are inherently sinful and a corruption of public morals.
Right.
They advocated for, a life of utmost seriousness. And during their period of influence in 17th century England, they actually outlawed theatrical performances of comedies.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the philosophical case against laughter also received further support from thinkers like Hobbes and Descartes, who provided their own kind of explanations rooted in their respective views of human nature.
That's right. So Hobbes and the Leviathan had this, view of human nature as being fundamentally individualistic and competitive.
Right.
And he argued that laughter arises from a feeling of what he calls sudden glory, which is this sense of superiority that's triggered by either our own sudden successes or by observing some failing in another.
Right.
Which then allows us to feel better about ourselves by comparison. And he even suggested that excessive laughter at the weaknesses of others might even be an indication of a lack of self-confidence.
Oh, that's a kind of unflattering depiction of laughter.
Yeah.
And Descartes weighed in with a similar perspective in his Passions of the Soul, didn't he?
That's right.
Right.
So Descartes connected laughter to the basic emotion of hatred, specifically derision or scorn.
Okay.
He describes it as a form of joy mixed with hatred at perceiving some minor flaw in someone that we judge to be deserving of it.
Okay.
And he argues that it's the unexpected nature of this realization, the surprise of wonder, that that prompts us to laugh.
Right.
And he even observed that individuals with obvious shortcomings are often quick to mock others.
Right.
Right, as if desiring to see everyone held in equally low regard.
Okay. So we've outlined a pretty pretty negative historical reception of humor within philosophy.
Yeah.
But the Stanford entry then kind of transitions to what it identifies as the three traditional theories of humor.
Right.
So let's start with the one that seems to resonate the most, I think, with this historical negativity.
Yeah.
The superiority theory. What's the central tenet here?
So as the name suggests, the superiority theory posits that the core of laughter is the expression of feelings of superiority.
Right.
And this could be directed at other individuals or perhaps toward a past version of oneself.
Okay.
And as we've seen, its roots can be traced back to, figures like Plato, the Bible, Hobbes, and Descartes.
Right.
And a more contemporary philosophical voice who aligns with this view is Roger Scruton,
Okay.
who analyzes amusement as a kind of attentive demolition of a person or something associated with them.
Okay.
Right, suggesting that laughter inherently diminishes its object in the eyes of the laugher.
But this idea that superiority is the fundamental basis of all laughter faced some pretty significant challenges and counter-arguments, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Heinz Hutcheson in the 18th century was a key critic.
That's right. So Hutcheson argued, quite persuasively, I think, that feelings of superiority are neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for laughter.
Okay.
And he offers this delightful example of laughing at peculiar figures of speech, such as describing the sun as a lobster boiled, right, where there's no apparent element of self-comparison or feeling better than someone else.
Right.
He also points out that we can feel superior to, say, animals without finding them amusing.
Right.
And conversely, we might feel pity for someone without finding their situation funny, even though we recognize our own, advantage.
And beyond those philosophical arguments, everyday experience seems to contradict this idea that superiority is always at play when we laugh. I mean, think about laughing at the incredible skills of a comedic performer,
That's right.
Or even laughing at our own silly mistakes.
Yeah, consider the amazing physical comedy in silent films.
Right.
We're very often filled with admiration for the performer's skill, not a sense of superiority over them. Right.
And, if you've ever spent ages searching for something only to find it in a very obvious place, your subsequent laughter at your own absent-mindedness doesn't seem to stem from feeling superior to your past self.
Right.
And even, in some experiments, people have been shown to laugh at objects that turn out to be unexpectedly heavy or light.
Right.
And that doesn't seem to involve any kind of interpersonal comparison or a feeling of sudden glory.
Right. So the superiority theory has some pretty clear limitations. Let's move on to the second of the traditional theories, the relief theory. This one sounds like it delves into some interesting ideas about psychological or maybe even biological processes.
Yes, it does indeed. So in its early articulation by Lord Shaftesbury, the relief theory proposed a kind of hydraulic model where laughter functions to release these built-up animal spirits within the nervous system.
Okay.
And later, as our understanding of biology advanced, thinkers like Herbert Spencer and Sigmund Freud, they updated the underlying mechanism.
But they retained that core idea that laughter serves to discharge accumulated nervous energy.
So Spencer, he viewed emotions as a form of nervous energy that naturally seeks expression through physical action. So how did laughter fit into this framework?
So Spencer argued that laughter is also a release of nervous energy, but with a crucial distinction.
Right.
The physical movements involved in laughter, they're not the initial stages of any practical action, right?
Whoa.
Such as, say, attack or escape. They're kind of a pure release of energy associated with emotions that we recognize as being, inappropriate or unnecessary in the given situation.
Okay.
And he illustrates this with the example of say a poem, right, where we might initially have a feeling of pity,
Right.
but then we burst into laughter, upon realizing that, say, the nephew in this poem is merely upset about wasting a postage stamp.
Right.
So the now superfluous energy of pity is discharged through laughter.
Okay. And Freud, of course, offered his own kind of intricate interpretation of the relief theory, in jokes in their relation to the unconscious. He saw laughter as releasing different types of energy depending on the specific, situation.
Yeah, precisely. So for Freud, in what he calls der Witz, or the joke,
right? Laughter serves to release the psychic energy that was being used to repress certain unconscious feelings.
Okay.
And very often these are, of a sexual or hostile nature.
Okay.
In the case of what he calls the comic, for example, laughing at, say, a clown's clumsiness,
Right.
the laughter there releases the mental energy that we would ordinarily expend on, consciously thinking about how to perform that action efficiently.
Okay.
And then in what he calls humor, distinct from Dervitz and the comic, it's more like the example of Mark Twain's story about, the docked pay.
Right.
So there, laughter releases the energy associated with a distressing emotion that we were on the verge of feeling, but then we managed to suppress.
Okay. So it's a very detailed system.
Yeah.
But, the Stanford entry points out that the relief theory kind of in general isn't really widely accepted today in either philosophy or psychology.
Yeah.
What are the main reasons for this decline in favor?
Well, a number of key issues have led to its decline.
Right.
Firstly, that very foundational hydraulic model of the nervous system is now considered obsolete.
Right.
Furthermore, many instances of humor just don't seem to be preceded by this buildup of emotional tension.
Right.
If you think of a spontaneous, witty remark, where's the pent-up energy that's being released there?
Right.
And even Freud's specific claims, they face challenges as well.
Okay.
So his assertion that joke creation is an unconscious process, that's contradicted by, the very deliberate strategies that many comedians employ.
Right.
And the supposed link between laughing at, say, hostile jokes and the release of repressed hostility, well, that hasn't been consistently supported by empirical research.
Right.
And his ideas about mimetic representation in the comic
Right.
also lead to some rather questionable implications regarding the energy expenditure of thought processes.
Right.
So while laughter undoubtedly involves some physiological energy expenditure,
Right.
the central tenet of the relief theory, this idea that it functions as a release of previously accumulated, emotional or cognitive energy, is largely considered untenable today.
Okay. So that brings us to the third of these traditional theories, and the one that the entry kind of suggests is currently the dominant perspective in both philosophy and psychology.
Yeah.
The incongruity theory.
Yeah.
What is the core proposition of this theory?
The incongruity theory proposes that laughter arises from our perception of something incongruous, something that violates our established mental patterns and expectations.
Okay.
And key proponents of this view include thinkers like Beatty, Kant, Schopenhauer, and Kierkegaard.
It sounds like there are some early hints of this idea even in the writings of Aristotle and Cicero.
Yes, indeed.
Right.
So Aristotle, in the Rhetoric, he suggests that one way to elicit laughter is by creating an expectation in the audience and then subverting it.
Okay.
And Cicero, on the Order, he explicitly discusses the very common comedic technique of setting up one expectation and then delivering something unexpected,
Right.
leading to laughter based on this disappointment of anticipation.
Right.
And this, I think, aligns very well with our modern understanding of, joke structure.
Right.
Right, with its setup and surprising punchline.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And James Beatty was apparently the first to explicitly use the term incongruous in this context. Right.
That's right. So Beatty argued that laughter originates from a sentiment or emotion that is triggered by the presentation of incongruous objects or ideas that are brought together in the same assemblage.
Okay.
So he really emphasized that unexpected and an unsuitable combination of different elements.
Okay. And Kant, he also focuses on this notion of violated expectations. Although he articulates it using slightly different terminology.
Yeah, so Kant famously describes laughter as an affection arising from the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing.
Okay.
And he provides some very vivid examples to illustrate this.
Okay.
So he talks about the tale of the Indian who is utterly perplexed when his ale turns into froth.
Right.
And the story of the heir who laments that the more he pays mourners to appear sad,
Right.
the more cheerful they seem.
Right.
So for Kant, the amusement, it's not a matter of intellectual satisfaction, but rather a kind of a physical enjoyment that stems from this internal jostling of our organs caused by these rapid shifts in thought.
Right.
And he compares it to the pleasure that we derive from, say, games of chance and music.
Right. Schopenhauer approaches the idea of incongruity from from a slightly different angle, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Focusing on the mismatch between, between our sensory perceptions and our kind of abstract, rational understanding.
Yeah. Schopenhauer argues that humor arises when we suddenly perceive the incongruity between a general concept and a specific real object that is supposed to fall under that concept.
Right.
So he uses the classic example of categorizing, say, both a tiny Chihuahua and a massive St. Bernard under, the single concept of dog.
Right.
And he believes that wit lies in identifying these unexpected concepts that seemingly disparate things can be subsumed under.
Right.
And this theory also offers an explanation for why being laughed at can feel offensive. Right, because it highlights a perceived incongruity between our self-perception and objective reality.
Right.
And the pleasure that we experience in humor, according to Schopenhauer, is the victory of knowledge of perception over thought.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And Kierkegaard, within his existential framework, he also views the comical as a form of incongruity, doesn't he?
That's right.
Specifically, a disparity between what is expected and what's actually experienced.
Right. So Kierkegaard employs the term contradiction rather than incongruity.
Okay.
But the underlying idea is quite similar.
Right.
And he draws a distinction between the tragic and the comic, building upon Aristotle's definition of the ridiculous as a painless mistake.
Okay.
So for Kierkegaard, both tragedy and comedy are rooted in contradiction.
Right.
But the tragic involves a suffering contradiction,
Right.
whereas the comic offers a way out. Right. It renders the contradiction painless.
Right.
And we see a similar sentiment expressed by Hazlitt, who suggests that, the basis for both tears and laughter lies in the discrepancy between what things are and what they ought to be.
The incongruity theory seems to have undergone some refinements over time, though. Some theorists kind of emphasizing the role of resolving the incongruity as key to the humorous experience.
Precisely.
Right.
So some contemporary psychologists, such as Schultz and Souls, have argued that our enjoyment of humor doesn't stem solely from the perception of incongruity itself,
right,
but rather from the moment when we get the joke, when the seemingly anomalous element is resolved by fitting into a new conceptual framework.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And Schultz even proposed that that humor can be differentiated from mere nonsense based on whether that incongruity can be successfully resolved.
Okay.
However, other theorists contend that incongruity resolution isn't always a necessary component of humor,
right,
and that our pleasure isn't always akin to the satisfaction of solving a puzzle.
Okay. And one of the significant challenges for the incongruity theory has been to explain why we find some incongruous things funny, while others evoke feelings of, fear or disgust.
Yeah. That's a very critical point.
Right.
Simply encountering a violation of our expectations isn't sufficient to produce, a humorous response.
Right.
And we see this even in Beatty, as an early advocate of the theory. He recognized that, other more powerful emotions like fear or disgust can override any potential reasonable emotion, as he called it.
Okay.
So more nuanced versions of the incongruity theory very often suggest that that humorous amusement involves not just perceiving an incongruity, but also actually enjoying it, at least in part for its own sake, rather than as a consequence of, some other emotional or cognitive process.
Right.
However, even with this refinement, there are clearly non-humorous ways of engaging with incongruity.
Right.
So you see this in art, for example, Oedipus the King, or depictions of the grotesque, the macabre, and so on.
Okay, so the incongruity theory seems to be the most robust, I think, of these traditional explanations.
Yeah.
But the entry then raises what it calls an irrationality objection.
Right.
So if humor involves, enjoying the disruption of our mental patterns, isn't that inherently irrational for beings who, presumably value understanding and predictability?
Well, this is a significant philosophical challenge.
Right.
If we are rational agents who value coherence and predictability, then why would we derive pleasure from something that, disrupts our understanding?
Right.
And even Kant himself, he viewed the pleasure in humor as purely physical, not intellectual.
Right.
And you have Santayana, who went even further and argued that incongruity in itself cannot be a source of genuine enjoyment.
Right.
And he labels the comic as a futility and an absurdity
Wow.
that a rational being couldn't truly appreciate.
Right.
So yeah, it's a real challenge.
So how do we address this irrationality objection? The entry proposes considering humor as a form of play.
Right.
Right.
So viewing humor through this lens of play, I think, offers a very promising avenue for explaining its potential benefits and thus countering that irrationality objection.
Okay.
And it's actually quite surprising that that few philosophers have explicitly explored this connection in depth.
Right.
So Kant did mention joking as a play of thought, but he didn't really attribute significant value to it.
Right.
Aquinas, following Aristotle, is, I think, a notable exception here.
Okay.
He viewed humor as a form of mental rest,
Okay.
and he highlighted its social benefits.
Right.
And he even coined this term eutrapelia
Okay.
to describe ready-wittedness.
Right.
So that's an important contribution.
Right. And in more recent times, thinkers like Max Eastman have drawn kind of explicit parallels between human humor, particularly laughter, and play behavior in animals.
Right.
Observing similarities even to the laughter of chimpanzees.
Right. So Eastman argued that we possess this instinctive tendency to laugh at what he calls pains presented playfully.
Right.
Suggesting that in both humor and play, we adopt this kind of detached, disinterested attitude towards something that might otherwise be perceived as, serious or threatening.
Right.
And contemporary psychology has also emphasized, the positive functions of humor.
Okay.
And the APA even lists humor playfulness as a character strength.
Right.
That fosters tolerance for ambiguity,
Right.
Enhances creative problem solving, and strengthens social bonds.
Right.
And we see this, the example of the humorous debt collection letter really effectively illustrates how humor can actually mitigate, potentially negative interpersonal interactions.
And the anthological perspective on play in young animals, as discussed in the entry, provides another kind of insightful angle on this.
Absolutely. So ethologists have observed that, young animals engage in play to learn essential skills and behaviors.
Right.
And this often involves exaggerated movements that help them to test their physical limits.
Right.
And Spinka suggests that this playful exploration contributes to their ability to cope with unexpected situations later in life.
Okay.
And you can see this as analogous to, adult human humor,
Right.
which offers a safe context to exercise our cognitive and social abilities in unconventional and even extreme ways.
And just as animal play often involves elements of, mock aggression, human humor frequently involves kind of playfully breaking the established rules of conversation, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Right.
So we very often violate, Greece's cooperative principles of conversation, for humorous effect, employing exaggeration,
Right.
presenting fictional scenarios as factual,
Right.
being deliberately evasive or ambiguous, or engaging in extended comic rants.
Right. Right. And the concept of